In 1990, Jonathan Larson was pissed off. Before there was Rent or Tick Tick Boom, there was a server from Soho who believed he could be the voice of his generation who was struggling to get anyone to listen. At the time, Larson seemed trapped in a never-ending cycle of rewrites, readings, and rejections for Superbia, his original sci-fi musical. Being well over 10 drafts and a handful of workshops in, it felt like a majority of people just didn't get it. Though, to be fair to the majority of the people, calling Superbia complex is putting it mildly. It had a space spy, an androgynous android, a group of mindless people electrocuting themselves for fun, an evil supercomputer, and a human being trying to get a music box into a nightclub on a giant space satellite. With all its complexity, the space musical underwent drastic transformations over its 7-year lifespan. Transformations that mirrored not only the changing values of society, but also the frustrating journey of an aspiring artist struggling to find his voice. This is the story of the terror that comes from the fear of being lost to time, and of the unrelenting perseverance of the artist. But above all else, this is a story of failure, and the strength that comes from it. More than 30 years after its final performance, this is the full story of Jonathan Larson's lost sci-fi musical, Superbia. Focus is distraction. And between Atari, Walkmans, and Madonna, distractions were abundant in 1980s America. The seeds of instant gratification and greed started to grow in New York City, specifically amongst one group of people, the yuppies. Short for young urban professionals, yuppies were a group of well-educated and success-driven members of society whose lives were determined by keeping up with the current trends, going to the most exclusive clubs, and consuming way too many drugs. For the most part, this extravagant lifestyle was confined to the Upper East Side of New York. But as soon as someone crossed the border into the East Village, any white-collar corporate ways of life were left on the other end of the rabbit hole. The grandiose and polished buildings were replaced by rickety, run-down apartments. Snazzy suits replaced by blue jeans and sneakers. Status replaced by counterculture. This was the land of Bohemia in all its glory. Despite its rough appearance, the 14-block neighborhood was a haven for the abstract in the 80s, with venues like Wow Cafe overflowing with performances that dared to go against convention, an attitude that perfectly mirrored the values of the bohos. It was a life dependent on going against the status quo, defined by a love for art, living a minimal lifestyle, and consuming way too many drugs. And this is where the two clashing worlds of the yuppies and the bohos intersected. Despite their opposing values and approaches to life, they both loved to party. And the best place to do so was Area Nightclub. Area was the perfect mix of yuppie exclusivity and boho eccentricity. It was part nightclub, part art installation, with the entire interior demolished and rebuilt from the ground up every 6 weeks, with elaborate themes and off-the-wall decor. One month, someone would be serving cocktails in a giant pool of alphabet soup, and the next, they'd be watching two armadillos having sex all night. According to a timeline written by Larson himself, the 25-year-old composer found himself in this world of whimsy on one night in February 1985. With the current theme centered on science fiction, the club was an intergalactic fever dream. Sci-fi was on Larson's mind ever since college. While attending Adelphi University on a full-ride acting scholarship, Larson started experimenting with writing music, composing many shows of his own for the school's cafeteria cabarets. By his sophomore year, thanks to Larson's increased confidence and fearless ambition, he wrote a letter to one of his biggest theatrical inspirations. Larson admired composer Stephen Sondheim's status as one of the great god-tier innovators of Broadway, with shows like West Side Story and Sweeney Todd only scraping the surface of his claim to fame. He was the one composer that challenged what musical theater could sound like. Sondheim's reply was gracious, if not brief, but to Larson, it meant everything. A staggered correspondence between the two emerged, and by graduation in 1982, Larson was fully committed to becoming a composer. As Al Larson, Jonathan's father, put it, Sondheim told him there were a lot more starving actors out there than starving composers. The hungry young graduate fled to the mecca of creativity, New York's East Village, all with one simple goal: change the face of musical theater forever. Thanks to the heightened prominence of the pop-infused music video, audiences in the 1980s were moving on from the traditional show tune style of music. Larson wanted to capitalize on this and make music that spoke to the MTV generation. The first step in achieving that goal? An all-rock musical adaptation of the novel 1984. George Orwell's dystopian sci-fi story follows Winston Smith, one of the last human beings capable of free thought amongst a horde of brainwashed masses. The world is overrun with television screens designed to distract humanity from feeling genuine emotions. Larson knew the book like the back of his hand, and couldn't help but notice the similarities between Orwell's fictional 1984 and the real 1984 he was about to inhabit. In a handwritten note from 1983, simply titled "Ideal Situation," 23-year-old Larson laid out the perfect strategy to open the show in just 1 year. Number 1, get a piano job. Number 2, 1984 gets considered by someone big. Number 3, apprentice with Sondheim. Number 4, summer on Nantucket. Number 5, compose score through September. 6, cast show in late September. 7, open on Broadway on January 1st, 1984. According to the Library of Congress, Larson recorded the show's roughly 45-minute demo track in his apartment living room that March. With the script and music in good shape, all he needed now were the actual staging rights to the book. Larson recruited an entertainment lawyer to open negotiations with the Orwell estate. Initially, talks looked promising. The rights holder to 1984, a Chicago lawyer named Marvin Rosenblum, desperately wanted to turn the book into a movie, but no one was biting on the film front, so theater seemed like a good alternative. However, discussions unexpectedly took a turn that winter, when Another Time, Another Place director Michael Radford threw his own hat into the race. When presented with the choice between the film director, whose most recent movie took place in a grim setting similar to Oceania from 1984, or the theater graduate, whose most recent gig was writing 3 tunes for Sesame Street, the decision was pretty clear. And just like that, Larson's Broadway aspirations hit a dead end. The number of Americans who were plugging into the never-ending stream of cable television was skyrocketing. Comedy television writer Norman Lear, the creator of hit 70s sitcoms such as All in the Family and The Jeffersons, noticed a concerning change in priorities as a result. In his 1984 New York Times op-ed titled "Bottom Linemanship," Lear desperately pleaded for society to reject the obsession with numbers defining success. Larson felt that the obsession with status, advertisements, and technology fueled a disconnect from the genuine traditions, emotions, and art forms that were becoming outdated at breakneck speed. This bottom line mindset even started to bleed into Broadway. The rise of the mega musical spectacle, along with the fact that theater owners were concerned over low attendance numbers, meant that soon every musical started to look and sound the same. To Larson, the only way Broadway could survive was by challenging the norm and targeting a crowd increasingly neglected by the theater world. The yuppies. They were young and unafraid to flaunt their wealth, especially if it elevated their chic status. To him, the next step in Broadway's innovation was to bridge the gap between popular music and musical theater. By this point, the yuppification of art was already well underway, with artists like area nightclub regular Andy Warhol elevating their work thanks in part to their lavish personal lifestyles. The line between talent and celebrity began to blur, with the actual art becoming secondary to the prestige of owning it. The combo of Norman Lear's bottom linemanship article, yuppie culture, the failure of the 1984 musical, MTV, and society's increasing addiction to television left Jonathan Larson's brain looking like an intricate series of circuits just waiting for a volt of electricity to bring them to life. The spark came that February, when Larson was invited to Area by close friend Jonathan Burkhart. Sitting in the projectionist booth with the multicolored carnival of lights dancing across his face, Larson got an idea. Instead of pursuing the rights for an already established work, he could just write his own show. It could still have a science fiction flair to it, but presented in a way that painted a comedic and satirical portrait of the 1980s. A world where people's worth was based on television ratings, and whether they could get by bouncers at the hottest clubs. A world becoming so obsessed with technology, it was losing touch with genuine emotion and individuality. As theater historian Jay Collis recounts in his wonderful book Boho Days, The Wider Works of Jonathan Larson, on this night, Larson envisioned Area as a space satellite, where the coolest of the cool were blasted away from New York's grime. And it was here that Superbia's world was born. By 1985, Jonathan Larson's confident post-university swagger was severely shaken. His apartment was in shambles. His works were continuously getting rejected, and the dreams listed in his ideal situation notes had long passed by. That spring, a frustrated Larson penned a letter to his former theater professor, Jacques Burdick, with one of the first eloquent lines reading, bullshit! As he sat at the reception desk of the PR firm where he was temping, Larson contemplated whether he should leave the concepts to higher-minded types and go back to acting. Larson had submitted his past two projects, 1984 and a musical adaptation of The Jungle Book titled Mowgli, to major agencies in the city, all of which came back with the same kind of response. Loved the music, but the book and lyrics were mediocre. When it came to writing, Larson's strength was in the actual melodies of the music, not the words between them. Despite his fear, Larson decided to push through the doubt and started scribbling down his ideas. As the weeks passed, the story came into focus. Grab a pen and paper because things are about to get confusing, but I'm gonna try to explain this the best I can. Superbia took place in the year 2064, in two different regions of a dystopian nation called, you guessed it, Superbia. Planet Earth was one giant suburb known as Outland, a plastic planet being orbited by a space satellite called In City. Part city, part nightclub, part reality show, in which every inch was covered with television cameras. Got that? Okay, good. Now buckle up, because things are gonna get even more complex. The world of Superbia revolved around a strict hierarchy based on status and the capability to feel emotions. At the bottom of the ranks were human beings. still capable of generating their own thoughts and expressing genuine sentiment. Just above them were the outs, desensitized middle-class drones whose entire existence revolved around buying products, called shapes, that they saw on TV. Or in Superbia's case, their media transmitters, MT for short. In the middle of the hierarchy stood the ins. The ins were stuck in a trance from living a life fueled by fame and a drug named the kilowatt, which consisted of them literally electrocuting themselves just to get high. The ins' main job was to party on air, get good ratings, and promote products on the MT for the outs to waste their money on. Near the top were the prods. These elites controlled Superbia, dictating what programs and products would be shown to the outs. They were also the only ones with direct access to the top of the food chain, an evil supercomputer responsible for controlling all of Superbia called the Master Babel Articulator, the dreaded MBA. The initial narrative centered on a character named Josh Out 177.5, one of the last people on the planet with an imagination, who accidentally invents a music box that has the power to make the mindless drones of Superbia feel again. After he meets Elizabeth In, 25149, Josh decides he needs to get the music box in front of the cameras inside In-City to awaken humanity from its technological trance. The problem is, outs aren't allowed in In-City, leading Elizabeth to create an alter ego to help Josh sneak in. Things get tricky, as if they already weren't, when Elizabeth's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Prod, catch on to their plan and send a spy named Hank to stop Josh. Josh evades Hank thanks to the music box, but once he finally makes it to In-City, he becomes bewitched by the addictive lifestyle of being an in. It's up to Elizabeth to help Josh come to his senses so they can use the music box to stop the NBA, her parents, and free the citizens of Superbia from their mindless consumption of media. My head. On a recommendation from Stephen Sondheim himself, Larson joined the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers in 1983. Every year, ASCAP offered a rare chance for aspiring composers to workshop their shows with established professionals. A workshop is a testing ground for artists to present their works in progress and get constructive feedback. The requirements for taking part in this workshop were intense. Shows needed to be near completion and ready to pitch to producers for a full staging. That October, Larson received a letter and braced for rejection. Superbia was chosen for the upcoming 1985 ASCAP sessions. But the hardest part was still to come, getting the show from the page to the stage. Luckily, he had two friends to help him out. A performer has to earn their stripes somewhere, and for Jonathan Larson, it was the Barn. Named the oldest summer stock theater in Michigan, Larson joined the company as an intern in college. It's here that he met actors Scott Burkell and Marin Mazey. The three just clicked, and created a friendship that would last a lifetime. Shortly after graduation, they all moved to New York and formed a cabaret troupe called J. Glitz. The troupe acted in part as an experimental testing ground for many of Larson's shows in development, and led to the creation of several flawed but promising numbers. Most notably, a beautiful piano piece titled After the Revolution that Larson wrote for 1984. As the ASCAP workshop drew closer, Larson called on his fellow Barneys to bring the lead characters of Josh and Elizabeth to life. ASCAP marked the musical's first presentation outside of Larson's living room. And as if that wasn't nerve-wracking enough, his panelists were Annie composer Charles Strauss and Stephen Sondheim. After a brief introduction and explanation of the show, Larson sat down at the piano and began to play a traditional music box melody, followed by Burkell singing, "After the Revolution, I'll build for you our own private music box. That's what I'll do." Once the sweeping and graceful melodies of that song ended, the mood of the performance took a complete 180 when Larson dove into an absurdly energetic number called Face Value that was oozing of 80s punk rock. The song was no doubt inspired by the same ruthless bouncers that turned away hordes of partygoers at Area Nightclub.
Face value, let's hear it. Droop your red in. Who do you know? Who are you with? Is your face on the list?
The consensus between the two panelists was that Larson's second song, Face Value, was expertly written, whereas After the Revolution, the 1984 holdover song, was severely lacking in quality. As Sondheim put it, the first one is in terrible trouble, whereas the second one is nearly perfect. Strauss and Sondheim both felt After the Revolution, with lyrics like, "Shall there be pink carnations? Shall there be cauliflower?" sounded cliche, and inadvertently misrepresented what the music box's powers actually were. Based on the lyrics, Sondheim figured the box's power was to make everything pretty, as opposed to its actual power of freeing people from their emotionless trance. This note played into Sondheim's overall main critique: the importance of ensuring everything in the story had a clear reason for being there. For example, why was Josh's number 177.5 instead of something higher? Did Josh invent the music box, or did he find it? If he found it, wouldn't it be broken in a way that could affect the sound coming out of it? It was clear to both Sondheim and Strauss that Superbia only truly thrived once it wandered away from the traditional and the conventional. As Sondheim put it, you have a weird show here, in the best way. Keeping Sondheim's notes in mind, Larson geared up for the second round of his ASCAP workshop that December. Josh Out 177.5 became Josh Out 177583962, and instead of inventing the music box, he accidentally found it, showed it to his family, who subsequently laughed him out of the house and forced him to run into the forest. This is where he met Elizabeth Inn, 27. Although she was still portrayed as an outcast from the in crowd, Elizabeth was given more dimensions, sharing a more romantic curiosity for the past. Likewise, her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Prod, played a much larger role in the direct conflict, as they forced Elizabeth to marry a narcissistic and arrogant character named Stud Star. The second workshop marked the debut of a song called Sextet. When Josh is initially denied access to Inn City by the bouncer in Face Value, he's able to sneak in thanks to a mysterious inn woman named Roy, spelt R-O-I, mistaking him for Hank the Spy. Roy is a bad influence, to say the least, as she spends the night getting Josh hopped up on kilowatts before eventually seducing him. Oh, also, Roy's a spy that's been paid off by Elizabeth's parents. Since every inch of Inn City is televised 24/7, Josh's night with Roy is broadcast to everyone in Superbia, including his parents. The sight of Josh playing with Roy's laser scored record high ratings and even earned him a nomination for the coveted Face Award. So the song was called Sextet, both because it was sung by 6 people, but also because, well, yeah. Much like the first workshop, Superbia proved to be divisive amongst the panel, specifically with 1776 playwright Peter Stone, who didn't think it justified being called a sci-fi. To him, the musical was nothing more than a simple boy meets girl tale. Unlike Sondheim's tactful and encouraging critiques, Stone was ruthless, continuously talking over Larson to attack Superbia. He believed the main message of technology robbing mankind of its humanity was ridiculous, and any attempts at sharing political viewpoints were weak. As the verbal spar between Larson and Stone intensified, it became clear that this was more than just an argument of conflicting mindsets. It was a case of the old school of thought versus the new school, desperately trying to get them to see what the world would and could become. Things got even more heated when a member of the audience came to Larson's defense. But Stone wasn't having it, telling the audience member himself that he disagreed with them very violently. When all was said and done, Stone was the first bouncer that kept Larson from Broadway. Sadly, he wouldn't be the last. Life is a numbers game. In the world of cold calling, it's believed that 100 calls leads to 10 appointments, which leads to 3 sales. Larson followed this same method after presenting Superbia to the Dramatists Guild. Instead of sitting back and waiting for success to come to him, he became an absolute marketing machine of phone call messaging and letter sending. He created a Superbia pitch packet consisting of a synopsis sheet, a script, a cover letter, and a demo track with his narration in between songs. Between May and July of 1987, Larson left no stone unturned, sending literally hundreds of letters and packets to anyone who ever has or ever would be anyone in the theater world. He reached out to regional theater owners, former ASCAP panelists, even established professionals he'd never met, like Les Mis director Trevor Nunn. By July, prospects and finances looked bleak. Larson was on the edge of poverty. With one of his last pitches to the Vineyard Theater in New York, the exhausted artist could only afford to send the script instead of his full packet. And then Larson waited. From August to November, the responses started to pile up, each one adorned with vibrant theater company logos that masked the words of rejection underneath. More dead ends. It made no sense. He'd taken all the notes from the experts and was told on numerous occasions that the improvements made the show better. He was told there wasn't a central villain, so he gave the NBA computer a more prominent appearance. He was told the music was too traditional, so he leaned heavier into a futuristic tone. He was told the world wasn't fully realized. He created an entirely new language called Superbiage, and still, Superbia was stuck on the launching pad. It felt like no matter what changes Larson made, the show still wasn't good enough to be taken seriously by the upper echelon of Broadway theater, leaving a dejected Larson tapping on a Casio keyboard in his freezing living room. Things took a dark turn in the latter part of 1987, and not just for Superbia. A series of global events led to the entire stock market crashing at a speed not seen since the Great Depression, a day that went down in infamy as Black Monday. In other words, all those young urban professionals hitting it big on Wall Street went broke in a matter of minutes. Larson's target audience vanished. Superbia entered its 4th year of pre-production pandemonium, and the world was vastly different than it had been when the show's life began in 1984. The multi-million-dollar mega musicals Larson despised dominated Broadway. Aria was opening its final party, Andy Warhol was dead, and a dark cloud loomed overhead as AIDS verged on national epidemic. Many of the friends that supported Larson's early readings now held steady corporate jobs, and Marin Mazzie started her second Broadway show, working with Stephen Sondheim of all people. As time crept forward, Larson felt both Superbia and himself getting left behind. The optimistic dreamer morphed into a frustrated and disheartened realist, and his writing responded in kind. Josh morphed from a klutzy, upbeat hero to a cynical pessimist. Elizabeth from the wide-eyed, hopeless romantic to an unfeeling specter. And the evil master plan took a bizarre and disturbing turn. In both versions of the show, the bottom-line crazed MBA concludes that humanity is unsustainable and the only way to prosper is by ridding the world of it. In every draft before November 1987, the NBA's plan of mass termination for the residents of Superbia played into the ridiculousness of everyone being too distracted by TV to care about an impending nuclear destruction. After the humans were eliminated, he and a group of clones planned to journey into space to continue searching for the bottom line. The later and darker version altered this ending by introducing the ominous next phase, and something called delimitation. Humanity's destruction would instead come from having their limbs removed, leaving only their heads in climate-controlled cubicles. Mindless brains in jars whose purpose was to just watch television. This change in stakes had massive ripple effects for the rest of the narrative. Now, the winner of the Face Award, mentioned in the song Sextet, became the celebrity spokesperson for delimitation. Any references to After the Revolution and the music box were scrapped. But perhaps the most consequential change came from the final battle. In original versions of the script, Josh breaks free of his in-city hypnosis thanks to Elizabeth's song Come to Your Senses, after which the two show the NBA there's more to life than statistics and numbers by quoting lyrics from West Side Story, My Fair Lady, and the song New York, New York. Ultimately, the charming back and forth of classics proves too much for the NBA, who overheats and dies. Elizabeth and Josh then banter about Josh and his sexy laser trick. They leave the music box in front of the cameras, run off stage, and successfully save the day. By comparison, everything post-November 1987 was, well, really sad. Elizabeth becomes a hand-picked bride for Josh, completely devoid of emotion. Feeling like she doesn't truly love him, Josh immediately resents her and flees to In-City to spend the last few hours of humanity partying. Before he leaves, however, he gives Elizabeth one final kiss and a rose in a final attempt to get her to feel something. In all, Elizabeth plays a much larger role in the later narratives, as the story followed her regaining the ability to feel, while Josh simultaneously loses his. In the tense final moments, Come to Your Senses was replaced with the song Won't Close My Eyes, as Elizabeth tries desperately, and unsuccessfully, to awaken Josh from his trance. Capable of now feeling heartbreak at the thought of not being able to love him, Elizabeth reaches into a broken television and electrocutes herself to death, only for Josh to come back to reality a second too late. After this, one version shows Josh and an elder out staring out at Earth, questioning if life is worth it. Another features the cast coming out and chanting "Love has no bottom line" repeatedly, while another one ends with the countdown to the next phase blaring ominously as Josh stares out at Earth saying, "You're so beautiful, I'm sorry." Either way, the NBA wins. There was no more witty banter about space lasers, just death in the worst way possible. One has to assume seeing Sondheim at work greatly influenced Larson's efforts on Superbia. After all, it was during this slew of rewrites that Sondheim personally invited Larson to attend the last 5 weeks of Into the Woods rehearsals. Around the same time, Larson learned of the Richard Rodgers Development Grant. The grant continues to be instrumental in the success of shows with Broadway potential, and has been awarded to the likes of Dave Malloy for Great Comet and Anais Mitchell for Hadestown. In 1987, an equally ambitious Larson viewed the grant as the best shot to get Superbia into a professional theater setting, and hopefully find someone to produce it. And yet somewhere in the slew of rewrites, side projects, and working at the Moondance Diner, the Richard Rodgers Development Grant nearly got away from him. The submission deadline was November 2nd, 1987. Larson submitted his application on November 2nd, 1987. The decision was left in the hands of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the committee's chair, Stephen Sondheim. That January, Jonathan Larson received the Richard Rodgers Development Grant. In a 1996 interview with Evelyn McDonnell of the New York Times, Sondheim was adamant that his personal relationship with Larson didn't factor into the decision-making, stating, "I wasn't championing a friend. I was championing a person whose work I liked. Everybody on the committee liked it too." In their nearly 6 years of correspondence, Sondheim watched Larson grow as both a writer and composer. Superbia was on Sondheim's radar just as long. The money from the grant meant Superbia could finally enter the next phase, a professionally staged reading at Playwrights Horizons. My desire is to locate new writers and work with them in a humane, almost psychoanalytical way to find out what they need in order to accomplish what they want. This quote from a New York Times article perfectly sums up Ira Weitzman. Originally joining Playwrights Horizons as an assistant to founder Robert Moss, Weitzman was a huge proponent of helping launch a series of Broadway masterpieces. Weitzman admired that Larson was trying something different. In an interview with Wait in the Wings, Weitzman recalled that he loved how Larson was bridging the divide between show tunes and pop rock. Weitzman knew Larson was talented and wanted to provide an opportunity to continue work on Superbia. The adjustment to creating in a professional setting was a difficult one to make for Larson. A big bulk of the songs Larson wrote were for his friends who couldn't perform at Playwrights because they weren't members of the acting union. Additionally, the show just didn't sound right due to the lack of a full band. In prior showcases like ASCAP and the Dramatists Guild, Larson relied heavily on taped accompaniments, made up of 4 different electronic keyboards, an electric guitar, an electric bass, a digital sampler, a percussionist, and a drummer. At Playwrights Horizons, he got 1 piano. As Weitzman recalls, one might characterize Larson as difficult to work with. Mind you, I don't see that as a negative. Sometimes we could not accommodate all of his needs, which made for some tension. The reading was less than ideal, and at intermission, Sondheim apparently told Larson he was going to miss Act 2. The lack of response to Superbia wasn't surprising to Weitzman. The technological demands for Superbia were far too expensive for an off-Broadway budget, and the actual narrative content of the show was far too confusing for Broadway itself. As Ira Weitzman put it, Superbia was unproducible. But I thought, just wait until the next one. As the decade neared its end, America was on the verge of entering an age of isolation. More Americans than ever were watching TV, and an experiment called the World Wide Web entered test trials. As humanity raced forward, Superbia was still stuck. Enter Victoria Leacock. Leacock and Larson met at Adelphi University during a production of Godspell in 1981. According to Leacock, she knew that Larson was going to be her first love from the moment they locked eyes. As the years passed, their romance turned into a deeply committed friendship, and she became Larson's biggest cheerleader, organizing and hosting countless readings for Superbia. In a life full of rejections, Leacock gave him a sense of acceptance. Frustrated with the presentation at Playwrights Horizons, the two decided if no one was going to give Superbia the staging it deserved, they were just gonna have to do it themselves. Leacock got to work planning a concert performance at the Village Gate for later that year. As February rolled around, Larson hit his 29th birthday. He grinded harder than ever to get the show staged somewhere, even if it meant outside of New York City. In a letter to his agent, Wiley Howsam, Larson shared 18 regional theaters he found in the Dramatists Guild directory. The list spanned the country, naming theaters from Connecticut to Utah. His request? All I ask is you do one more push for Superbia, and then we'll let it rest. The following month, Howsam started forwarding Larson the responses. Yet another flood of rejection letters, some harsher than others. To make matters worse, one of them was a letter from Howsam himself, informing Larson that due to the downsizing of his agency, ICM, it meant he was being dropped as a client. After 5 years of excruciating, frustrating, and demoralizing work on Superbia, Jonathan Larson was again left with no clear direction. Perhaps the only way out of this perpetual maze was to go back to the start. As Leacock and Larson pushed forward on their Village Gate concert, Ira Weitzman set his own plan into action, recommending Larson to an aspiring playwright named Billy Aronson. Aronson was in a similar situation to Larson, desperately wanting people to produce his plays, but constantly getting rejected. As Weitzman said in an email to WITW, "I secretly always hoped that John would find a collaborator. I loved his melodies, but not all of his lyrics. He was also not a natural book writer, and Superbia was a mess in that department." Late in the summer of 1989, Jonathan Larson guided Aronson to his favorite meeting spot on the roof of his apartment. The two started brainstorming, and after hearing Aronson's idea, Larson immediately jumped at it. From what Aronson was proposing, this was the piece Larson was waiting for. This was the show that could finally speak to the MTV generation. That September, Larson and Leacock presented their staged rock concert version of Superbia at Village Gate. Even though the performance wasn't as quote-unquote professional as Playwrights Horizons, it was perhaps the most genuine and closest realization of Larson's creative vision. Instead of one piano, the venue blared with the full band required to capture Superbia's distinct sound. Larson didn't have to stick to using only classically trained union actors, meaning he could showcase his longtime friend in the role of Josh, a relatively unknown actor named Roger Bart. Larson finally got the chance to perform in the show himself, playing Josh's father and one of the original rock stars that founded Superbia. All in all, the concert was charming in its modesty. There was no set, just a single projector, a few music stands, and a ton of homemade costumes. The outs looked like they came right out of Leave It to Beaver, and the ins looked like members of the Matrix, with black jackets and plastic sockets for their kilowatts. When all was said and done, the cabaret originally intended for a small audience wound up being performed to a raucous crowd of roughly 420 people. The upper echelon of Broadway might not have understood Superbia, but the people did. However, much like every other presentation before it, the Village Gate performance failed to drum up any interest among producers. But thankfully, the new show he was working on with playwright Billy Aronson offered an outlet for that creative angst. After just a few months, Larson recorded a demo track for the new show's first 3 songs. It wasn't long until progress on the show stalled, with Aronson and Larson both reaching a creative impasse. Much to Larson's dismay, the two ultimately decided to call it quits. Although losing the show was disheartening for Larson, it made him realize that maybe there was a life after Superbia. In 1990, Jonathan Larson was pissed off. A project he saw immense potential in slipped out of his hands, Superbia was belly up, and he was still no closer to conquering Broadway. The persistent failure inevitably blended with Larson's fiery passion and his annoyance with the gatekeepers who continually dismissed or undersold his work. Larson spent the majority of the year funneling his grievances into a one-man rock monologue called 3090, an impassioned and vulnerable piece where he laid out the arduous 7-year journey of trying to juggle life and art during the creation of Superbia. Sick of hearing everyone tell him that his futuristic rock musical was too large to stage, Larson opted to strip away any possibility of pageantry. 3090 would just be him, a piano, and a small band. By design, the monologue was incredibly inward-facing. After all Larson had been through, how couldn't it be? However, Larson's view of the world was forced to quickly widen when 4 of his close friends became very ill. Nearly 2 years after Superbia's stage reading at Village Gate, Larson was presented one last shot when he unexpectedly received 2 offers for the show. One was for a theater festival in the UK called the Quest for New Musicals, and the other was from the Public Theater in New York. The offer from the UK was tempting, but it was stated that Superbia would only be eligible for further consideration. This meant that the show might not even be performed, but the festival would still hold all rights to the show for the next year regardless. Knowing that this could stall the possibility of a New York run, Larson decided that the safer option was to go with the public. As Jay Collis puts it, this may have been the biggest mistake he could have made. As he arrived at the Public Theater for the reading, Larson was informed that the show was double booked with that year's company Christmas party. And the party started at intermission. Superbia played to a mostly empty house as the noise of the Christmas party flooded into the theater. This was its final staging. A year later, the AIDS epidemic ravaged New York, with nearly 20% of all United States-based cases diagnosed in the city. As Steve Cohen writes, Larson felt that 3090, now retitled Tick Tick Boom, was too much about his personal career, and that he needed to write something with a larger scope. Larson couldn't stop thinking about that show that he and Billy Aronson abandoned in 1989. Larson desperately wanted to continue working on it on his own. According to an article by Playbill, Larson asked his friend Jonathan Burkhart, "How do I do it? How do I get this away from Billy where it's legal, it's proper, and if anything becomes of it, I can compensate him?" Burkhart told Larson just to ask him. That winter, Jonathan Larson sent the most important letter he'd ever written. To his surprise, Aronson hadn't stopped thinking about the piece either. And even though they disagreed narratively, he still didn't want to see those 3 songs they'd written go to waste. In the end, the two made an agreement that if anything happened with the show, Aronson would receive credit and compensation for his work. And the rest is history. Structurally, Superbia never had a satisfying ending. It didn't matter whether it was the optimistic dreamer saving the day or the grief-stricken hero succumbing to his fate, there was never a clear resolution to the story. The same can be said for the show itself. Superbia is just one example of the millions of shows that never make it past pre-production. But it's important to remember that a show's failure to launch isn't a direct reflection of the artist who created it. Scripts are more than just dozens of sheets of loose-leaf paper bound together by cheap plastic coils. They're reflections of the person who wrote them. A snapshot chronicling a person's perception of the world in a distinct moment in time. For Jonathan Larson, Superbia was always more than just a show. It was his refuge. A place in which he could express himself through the characters on the written page and use their intricate world as a means of escape. As the years continued, the voices of those he revered found their way into this hideaway and tried to turn it into something it wasn't, as Larson incorporated every critique he got. Superbia proved that no matter how well connected or how perseverant an artist is, there comes a time they need to move on and accept that sometimes the maze just doesn't have an exit. As Ira Weitzman put it, "I think Sondheim said Superbia was unsolvable." And he was right. There were so many times that Larson was susceptible to the could-have phenomenon. The frustration could have taken over to where he began to hate writing. He could have accepted that a life in the arts wasn't feasible. And he could have resigned himself to the fact that Broadway didn't want him. But thanks in large part to his friends and mentors, those could-haves didn't become never-dids. Without Jonathan Burkhart, he might have never walked into Airy Nightclub. Without Marin Mazzie and Scott Brickell, his music might never have come off the page. Without Stephen Sondheim, he might have never gotten through the rejections or put himself out there in the workshops. Without Ira Weitzman, he might have never started collaborating with others. And without Victoria Leacock, he might have never seen the potential in his work, or gotten a taste of the off-Broadway world responsible for launching his career. Sadly, the world Larson envisioned while writing Superbia has come true. For so many people, our worth is based on if we're ins or outs. The value of art continues to be placed on the trends and the numbers, making it harder and harder to succeed with experimentation. Most of the bohemian magic of the village is gone, paved over by high-end apartments and corporate chain stores. But the spirit of those experimental times didn't go away so easily. When faced with the mid-2010s Broadway landscape suffering from the aftermath of the 80s mega musical craze, one show managed to do what Superbia couldn't, and pushed through the noise to finally usher in something refreshingly forward-looking. And it all started with a lesbian cartoonist.